Welcome to Sight and Scene, the podcast where technology meets terrain and insights transform our understanding of the world. Hosted by industry experts with decades of experience, Sight and Scene dives into the cutting-edge tools and techniques reshaping how we visualize, map, and interact with the spaces around us.
In each episode, we explore the latest advancements in drones, GIS, CAD, geomatics, and scanning, showcasing applications not just in the built environment, but across a spectrum of industries from environmental monitoring to urban development and beyond. We bring you stories from the field and interviews with fascinating people on the cutting edge of geospatial technology.
But when you're out there before the fire, there was like feet thick of just duff and detritus on the ground. And it was so lush and so beautiful. And the fire out there was so hot that it completely burned off all of the soil and all the top. So it was just left barren rock. Okay. You are here at Sight and Scene once again. And I'm with my co-host, Scott Harrigan. How are you today, Scott?
Very good. How about you, Mike?
I'm doing pretty good. I guess I would be doing better if there wasn't such just tragic news across the airwaves right now. It's really tough to see what's happening in Southern California, and that has prompted us to have a discussion. We talked about we're not a podcast following the news trends and cycles, but when things are so impactful and they're related to our industry, we want to address them as they're relevant and in the public sphere and folks' minds. So today we're going to focus on a broader concept of drones for good, because unfortunately there's once again someone doing something with their drone over the fires of Southern California was not cool and really unfortunate, but trying to turn the spotlight back on how drones are being used for good, and specifically in natural disasters. So we're probably going to have multiple different series or episodes that might focus on a different use case around these types of things. But today we're just going to give you more of a 10,000 foot view and an introduction to what's coming up as a 3-part episode around this, where we're going to be talking about prevention of these, like use of these tools for prevention, and then use of tools. When I say these tools, we're talking drones and other reality capture tools, laser scanners, LiDAR, thermal drones for the emergency response, and then for the recovery. So there's lots of ways these tools are being used for good across the spectrum when it comes to natural disaster.
Yeah, it's a big topic. Obviously, a very prescient one, but also I think is maybe one of the most quickly developing ones. We talk about surveying. We've done that. We're going to cover all of that stuff more, but I think this is where use of drones is like brand new, and people are doing a lot with them that just has no there's no prior reference to it. There's a lot of interesting things that only a drone can do, and only remote sensing can do. So that's the positive part of this,
for sure. But maybe we can start out with a public service announcement to all drone pilots. I would hope that most commercial drone pilots know better, because it's part of getting your Part 107. But there are a lot of recreational pilots out there that maybe get your drone and you don't get your trust certificate, or you haven't got it yet, and you're just excited to fly your drone, and you're excited, maybe excited not being the right word, but you want to show the devastation to help people understand what might be happening as a result of the circumstances of a particular disaster. But do not fly your drone into an airspace that is restricted or being heavily used by the folks in the recovery effort. And we're definitely going to talk more about this as it relates to what are the regulations around this. But we're specifically talking to a person who flew their drone and ran into the wing of a critical piece of recovery. The Super Scooper plane put a hole in the wing, took it out of commission. So not good.
Yeah.
Not cool.
And to add to that, I think a lot of us drone pilots, when we see the news and we see something come out, a lot of times we're our first reaction is, are they sure that's a drone? Because we've certainly had our fair share in the news lately of drone incidents that may not be drone incidents, or like drone spottings that may not actually be drones. This is one where, you know, the details are still forthcoming, but I think as we were looking at it, we were prepping for the show, you know, they recovered a drone. They recovered evidence of a drone, and all of the impact and the photos. It looks like this is quite definitely a drone from the information that's out there. So where I normally start and say, oh, you know, people are being, you know, a little paranoid, and are we sure it's a drone? Yeah, it's there's really solid evidence to prove that this is the case. So I think, like you, I'm now in mode of, okay, we absolutely need to you know, explain the rules here and really convey to people how bad a thing this is that you can do.
Right. Yeah. And we touched on this a little bit too during our Midnight Rotor episode when discussing drones in the night skies. But we're going to get into that in more detail in this episode. But before we do, we're going to share a couple fun facts, or maybe not so fun facts, just anything that's relative to, again, our region or the episode. So Scott, you want to kick us off today?
Sure. Yeah. So a little background to my fun fact. I have been doing quite a bit of flying here in the U.S. Northeast. It is officially winter. It's finally gotten quite cold over here. And I've been thinking a lot about like battery life. As many people know, your drone's battery tends to be, you know, you get less flight time in colder weather with battery life, and got me thinking about endurance and how long aircraft can stay aloft in general. And so I decided to look up what is the longest flight that's ever been done time-wise. Like, what's the longest someone's been in the air consecutively? And that is actually still a world record that is held from 1958.
Wow.
I've got it pulled up here. I believe the guy is his name is Doc Bailey, if I've got that right. I think so. Basically, this guy was basically did it as a publicity stunt. He had a hotel that he was just opening up in Vegas, and this is the 50s, where like Vegas was still very largely undeveloped. And as a publicity stunt, and he did this with FAA approval, so that's kind of the crazy part. Even back then, he did it by the book. He flew his Cessna 172, so just regular Cessna that was fitted to carry extra large fuel tanks, and he flew it for just shy of 65 days. It was something like 64 days and 20 something hours. And the way he did it is he would fly over, and he'd fly till he was like starting to run low on fuel, and then they had this really long strip of road where he would go really low and then get a fuel tanker to drive up alongside him and refuel the aircraft. And they did this over and over and over. He had a co-pilot. They had stuff on board to basically stay, fed and all of that, which is just crazy. And he got it for 64 straight days, which is crazy.
That is nuts.
Yeah. I mean, wild.
I think of not sleeping in my own bed for one night, but imagine sleeping on a plane. Oh my gosh.
Oh man. Yeah. I'm cranky if I've been, in a hotel for 2 days, let alone an aircraft there. And it is 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds. And even just little fun fact here, it says, to prevent any funny business such as clandestine landings, officials raced down a runway at McCarran Field in a convertible Ford Thunderbird and painted white stripes on the tires. So I think the idea is that he couldn't they'd see the white paint if he accidentally landed somewhere as proof. So they even had this guy to keep him honest. Crazy one. And
wow. That's impressive and a little bit nuts all at the same time.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good one, Scott. Appreciate you sharing that.
Sure.
Mine's taking a completely different path, and maybe it's I don't know, maybe not so fun, but interesting. And I'm focusing again on my bioregion here in the Pacific Northwest, and particularly around forests, because living here in the Pacific Northwest, the forests are a big part of our lives here. I mean, think about Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks, the planet, just these temperate rainforests of lush ferns and understory and 200-foot tall trees. And it's just a really amazing part of where we live. And for me, my last 10 years working for a design build firm that was focused on sustainable building, I was able to bring my advocacy and my activism to work every day by design, helping design and build some zero energy buildings. But anyway, I've always had a love of the forest, having grown up next to one in the Midwest. But here, things are changing, and we're talking about the climate changing, and it used to be called global warming, and I think now it's evolved to be climate change. And I think people would have a hard time disputing that our climate is changing.
Yep.
There's definitely lots of opinions as to why and how and all of that, but we're not going to get into that. But we're just acknowledging that the climate is changing. And I actually had a course where the professor was saying the global weirding of weather, like the extremes are becoming more extreme, the highs higher, the lows lower. So just part of how that's impacting our bioregion here in the Pacific Northwest is that those temperate rainforests, the Ewok planet, was that Andor?
I think so. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So a lot of these trees, we're talking Doug firs, sequoias, cedars. A lot of these trees are having a hard time keeping up with the warmer, drier temperatures that are starting to creep up in these temperate rainforest areas. So a lot of southern Oregon is very much like California. So if you think about a California landscape, a little more scrubby, drier, that is predominantly southern Oregon. And then you start to reach this threshold as you move up through Oregon where there's more rain. It becomes this temperate rainforest. So as the climate is changing, more of that southern Oregon flora is starting to propagate here in these areas that are more accustomed to that. So what we're seeing is more like hardwoods, like the Oregon white oak, which is beautiful, beautiful wood, very resilient wood, and it's a beautiful tree. But nonetheless, it's just highlighting the fact that how these things change over time as it responds to the environment around it, and then what that could mean as far as implications for like the future of natural disasters and these things. So it's just something that has been on my mind as I see some of the flora here struggle a bit, in particular cedars. Like cedar trees are really having a hard time with this shift in climate here, and they're more and more, you have to go further and further north to get these really healthy stands of old growth cedar.
Yeah.
But it also, I just wanted to mention one last thing because I do love trees and I love the forest. There's an amazing book. It's called The Hidden Lives of Trees. And it talks a lot about how trees communicate through the mycelium and all the fungal networks underground, and how they're sharing nutrients. And it's just a fascinating book. And it really opens your eyes a little bit to how forests operate and what that could mean for forests that are managed better to be healthier ecosystems. So just if you're interested in this kind of stuff, check that book out. It's a good one.
That's a great fun fact, first of all, to bookend our episodes here, and I'm definitely adding that to my reading list, because my takeaway on this is it's all connected, right? Like good emergency management is environmental sustainability. They are absolutely connected, and I think what we see, before we even get into the logistics of fires and emergencies, what we're seeing here is at its heart environmental policy as well. And I just think about that a lot. And before we, like, the prelude to everything we're going to talk about, I think does rest in that area. And I'd love to cover that in a future episode too, of what does wildlife management, environmental management, what all that entails. So great choice.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so hopefully not too much of a downer, but I think awareness is important. And I want to share a quote too, maybe to just kind of cap this off. And this was around World War II time, where Winston Churchill said, "You could count on America and Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities.
That's very fitting.
I think there's some truth to that. And unfortunately, I'm very much an optimist, but I don't know. I just think that when it comes to climate change, there's going to be some pretty uncomfortable times ahead before people really are like, we can't look away from this anymore.
Absolutely.
Okay. Moving on. So we are talking about drones for good, and specifically how they're used for natural disasters. And that could be in the post recovery, during the disaster, and preventative work. Today, though, we're going to really just keep it high level and then bring in some experts in the following episodes to talk more in depth about things that Scott and I are not too savvy on, or just our expertise don't lie in these areas. So we're super excited to bring that to you here soon. But let's talk about the LA fires just very briefly.
I had watched an interview recently where a California firefighter was saying, we don't have enough. It's not bringing more fire trucks, right? They don't have enough fire trucks. He's like, you'd have to deploy a fire truck, every single fire truck in California, all at once to this area, and then some more to respond in the way that you respond to a single structure fire or a single incident. So it exponentially grows. So I will add, while we're looking at that, you can also go to fire.ca.gov. It's a great resource, actually, if you are in the area, because it shows the current status of the fire. It also gives you whether the area is under an evacuation order. So, if you need a quick way to see where are you in relation to what's going on, fire.ca.gov has some really good tools here.
Yeah. I think it's hard for most of us around the country and around the world, for that matter, that are looking at this from the outside in and not seeing. I've seen some aerials. The news stations are coming in and showing the devastation, and it is horrible. It's just tragic loss of life and structures and forests, and it's so hard to see these things, and not to put this just negative spin on things, but the natural disasters, I think, unfortunately, are going to become more frequent before they get better. And it's all being fueled by, we'll say lots of things: population growth, these urban growth boundaries that are expanding further into natural areas. So it's a complicated issue, and I think it's really important to focus on what are the things that we could do that positively impact our response and prevention and recovery to these things, and try not to mix the pot with things that are counterproductive to that. Let's spin this back into how the industry that we're involved in, which is, we'll just call it broadly reality capture, but the tools that we typically use on a day-to-day basis. What are some of these tools, again, for our listeners? Because we've definitely covered them extensively in some of our previous and upcoming episodes, but there's types of tools and deliverables that are extremely beneficial to helping with natural disasters. Do you want to cover some of these, Scott?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with just the basics, right? Kind of going back to what we were talking about in previous episodes, we're looking at just basic mapping, right? That's involved in both the pre and the post recovery of these incidents. It can be used during as well, but obviously when you're in the middle of a fire and have stuff going on, you're usually focused on mitigating that and not mapping and analyzing it. But just basic imagery, right? A lot of real basic assessment of the extent of the fire is done through aerial imagery, and that's acquired by manned aircraft as well, a lot still, but more and more drones are being used, especially when you're looking at like the neighborhood level and you're trying to look at what is the actual damage on an individual neighborhood level. So that's a big one there.
Yeah. It also helps with logistics too. And you mentioned that it's preventative and in the post recovery, but there are instances where mapping can help in real time.
Yeah.
And this is some of the benefits of these tools that are a little bit more nimble, such as drones, as opposed to sending up a manned aircraft with really complicated, expensive photogrammetry equipment, where let's just say there's a line crew, a fire crew that is trying to establish a break line ahead of the fire, and they're going up a steep canyon, and obviously the fire is still a ways away. They're trying to keep it from growing. They could have a drone map this really steep ravine and give some updated information to the fire crews to help navigate and logistics around setting these break lines and getting up in there. And again, I'm not an expert on firefighting, but I think we will hopefully bring somebody on that's going to be able to talk to some of this stuff more specifically. But they're in the real time, in that recovery, or sorry, in that response, that these tools and mapping can be used in those fashions as well, to get updated topos and obstacles and all kinds of things to aid in the logistics of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe moving like from mapping over to logistics, and many of that, there's quite an overlap there. But I was just looking up, there is do have a pretty good concrete use case here of, actually it's a article that Esri had published in 2023 of looks like, drones more and more are being used in real time. They were explaining that there was a startup that was flying drones at several thousand feet looking at this area and using infrared thermal cameras, right, which are very good at detecting heat, right? And they're using that, and they are actually using that technology to establish the current fire perimeter. So obviously the perimeter is such an important thing to establish, because that's how evacuation orders are. So many decisions are made off that, right? I'm sure, again, not an expert in this, but I'm sure comparing perimeter 1 to perimeter 2 over a certain span of time is how you can create a trend of fire growth and how fast it's spreading and in what direction it's spreading. But also evacuation orders are based off those perimeters. So it is a big decision there, establishing the perimeter of a fire. And so they're able to do that now very, very quickly, because they use a drone, they use a thermal camera, they're capturing all that data in real time and putting it into GIS.
Amazing. I did want to share a quick use case story, because obviously here in Oregon, we're no strangers to fires out here as well. A lot of folks, when you think of Oregon, you're like, oh, it rains all the time. Yeah, it rains a lot in the winter, but during the summer months, the faucet shuts off and it is dry here for months without a drop of rain. So we have, we're always hoping for this big moisture winter and a battery of snow up in the mountains, because that helps us out tremendously. But nonetheless, in 2020, we had devastating fires all through Oregon. And I want to say it was over 1 million acres were burned in Oregon. And one of those was the Santiam Fire, which is in, I guess, Central Oregon in the Cascade Mountains, straight east of Eugene and Salem, Oregon. So kind of in that area, there were 2 large fires that combined into one massive 400,000 acre fire. And some of these fires also were knocking on the door of Portland, like the city boundaries of Portland. I was actually in an evacuation zone 3. So the different levels is 1 is like get out immediately, 2 is be on standby, and 3 is just have an awareness around what's going on. But our air quality here was horrendous. People probably remember, Portland has the worst air in the world right now. We were AQI of 350, 400, even up into the 500, where we were locked indoors for almost a week. And, we had box fans with furnace filters taped to them, and running your fan on your furnace with a filter, just trying to, well, that's if you could get a filter, because all the stores sold out. But it was just, not being, obviously not nearly as impacted as folks are, where their homes burn down or there's loss of life. But even just being in a situation where we were on notice and the air quality was horrendous, you couldn't go outside. The day sky was, it was like night. I mean, it was crazy. So It's definitely something that I've experienced, and we experience here on occasion. But the Santiam Fire there's a organization, a nonprofit organization. They're called Opal Creek Ancient Forestry Center, which has an education outpost. It's a nature education outpost in the Opal Creek wilderness. And it was, first of all, they're an amazing organization, nonprofit, doing all kinds of education programs for kids and getting people outdoors and experiencing nature. So I definitely want to mention them, because a fantastic group of folks.
Awesome.
But we've used, not used, but the company I used to work for, we'd have our company retreats out at this education outpost. So it was in the old growth forest, and it was one of the last stands of old growth forest that could have been logged but didn't, and it got preserved. So there are these opal pools in this river, and it was kind of this famous hiker spot. The Pacific Crest Trail runs through there. So it's just a gorgeous place. And there was an old mining camp out there, which is called Jawbone Flats. And Jawbone Flats, surprisingly, one of the structures remained out there, but all the other ones burned down. And some of the trees around the area did okay, but the rest of the ridges and valleys were just absolutely scorched. Wow. And I was so they reached out to me to do some mapping of their site after the fires. And I was one of the first handful of non-employees to make it out there. And I remember going out, had to go through several Forest Service gates and with codes and special permissions and permits to get out there. And you're driving down this gravel road for, well over an hour, and there's standing dead burn trees all around you. Some had fallen in the road since the last time someone had driven through there. So it was quite an ordeal to get out there. But I brought my drone, and we mapped the Jawbone Flats area to quantify the amount of debris from all the buildings that had collapsed and burned and were just sitting there in piles, so that they can aggregate all the volumes of material that needed to be hauled out of there, so they could submit that to FEMA to get funding. So it was an amazing use case of the drone that helped them out tremendously. And I've since been working with that organization to help in the rebuild of their outpost as well. They were completely off the grid. They had a micro hydro water station, so they had this big water line that went up this steep valley, fed water into a Pelton wheel, and that's how they generated their electricity with this Pelton wheel. So
wow,
it was amazing.
Yeah.
But when you're out there before the fire, there was like feet thick of just duff and detritus on the ground, and it was so lush and so beautiful. And the fire out there was so hot that it completely burned off all of the soil and all the top. So it just left barren rock. Like, it looks, you've seen those pictures of Mount St. Helens after the eruption, where it just like trees knocked over and just twigs everywhere. And just the ground is, it was sad and incredible when I went out there to see that. But anyway, we also use drone mapping to help plot the new route for this water line that's going to come down and feed their new micro hydro station. So just a couple really relevant use cases that's speaking to the fires, and here locally where mapping helped them tremendously, not only with their immediate recoveries with FEMA, but then in the planning of resilience for their campus here. Now they've hired a whole design team and engineers, and I'm working closely with them to continue using the drone and other tools for supporting their redevelopment efforts out there.
Well, that's an amazing use case. I don't think we could have found a better one there, because I think what you illustrated there is such a great example of, I think, especially, being an East Coast person who's like watching this all through social media and all that, I think so many of us see this stuff happen, and then like we have this air of like, oh, well, now what? Like it's over. It's terrible. I know I doom scroll, right? And I have this air of like, it's just all negative and all that. And I think so many people say like, what do we even do? And what you've illustrated there is such a perfect example of what you can do, right? I mean, you volunteer your time and you worked with this group, but just, it's great to hear that there are so many good organizations who do care and who are willing to use this technology. And like, I love hearing that stuff, because it's such a concrete, real benefit. It's not like, oh, we flew it and, we took, pictures of this and that for awareness, which is good, not knocking that, but that you're actually able to, get more FEMA money, right? Quantify what's going on here, get the water reestablished. Like, that's so many measurable good things that improve the quality of life and the environment. And it's always to me puts a hopeful spin on all this, and that it's being done with technology, and that it's actually being put to good use. So that's a great one. I appreciate sharing that one. I know you'd maybe give me a little tidbit of that story, but as I'm hearing it in all its glory right now, that's just so cool and very, very motivating for me of thinking of what you can do.
Yeah, and there's we have a few more bullet points that we wanted to talk about and hit on how these tools are being used, and some of these are also relevant to the upcoming work. So they're studying the forest and the recovery of the forest after a major forest fire like that. So they're watching the undergrowth come back up, like what's sprouting. So there's teams of biologists and ecologists out there who are studying how forests respond. There's a thing called snag persistence. So when you have these standing dead trees, like how do those actually how long do they stand? Because there's a safety factor of some of these large trees. I mean, the trees here in the Pacific Northwest, 150 to 200 plus feet, these Doug firs, just massive trees. And largely, the trunk of these things is intact, right? Like the obviously all the needles, the tree is dead, but the core of the tree still has a lot of strength to it. So it could stand there for another 100 years before fungi gets in there and erodes it out, and it falls over and becomes a hazard to roadways, whether it be blocking a road and you don't have access and when you need it, or whatever that is. So the study of that is snag persistence. So that's one thing they're looking into right now, is how do we document and track some of these things. And there's ways that these tools, whether it's a aerial LiDAR platform or a ground-based LiDAR, we're mapping roadways out to this outpost. So there's all kinds of ways that in this research piece that's happening after the fact of like, well, how do we benefit future studies and generations with having this canvas, this classroom out here and using some of these tools. So they're using it like that. They're also, because it was an old mining camp, there's an archaeological component of it where they have to do an archaeological study and tag all of these old relics and mining equipment out there because it's been designated as such. So there's, we talked about thermal being used for helping identify thermal anomalies that might be now under the undergrowth of the new flora coming in. So super interesting. And I'm so honored to be part of this whole experience with Opal Creek Ancient Forestry Center, because it's been it's brought some, again, that concept of drones for good. I'm always wanting to use my business as a force of good, and any opportunity I have to do that, I'm jumping at it. So a couple other bullet points on here, Scott, was maybe we could just quickly run through these that we haven't touched on yet.
Yeah. So one of them, just talking a little bit about insurance, right? It's a post-fire one. So that's, I haven't been too involved in this side, but as I understand it, insurance companies are using drone imagery all the time. But I'll admit this can be for both good and bad to the homeowner, right? On the positive side, it absolutely. I saw some articles and some stories of it. It actually did help, where it helped the homeowner actually get a more competitive rate in repairing their roof based on the existing condition. So there are times where the insurance company makes assumptions about what a roof is like, what the damage is like, and that may be incorrect. And so they can use drones to find the actual conditions and correct those assumptions. It can work the other way too, where, an insurance company that wants to remove somebody from a policy could use that information to possibly do that. So, that one I'm a bit mixed on. Maybe I'll let an insurance, someone with experience.
That's a complicated one too. Yeah. I know there's a lot of stuff that's, I think, going to bubble up
Absolutely.
from this whole thing.
And exactly, and the complexities of insurance and all this are probably, I want to say for a different podcast episode, but maybe there's a podcast out there that's covering that in a better way
Yeah.
than I could, that focuses on insurance. But I think it's worth being aware of what drones are doing in that space.
Yeah. I'm also seeing the investigation and forensic aspect of things. I think that's could be pre, post, during, and I want to highlight this with saying that it's, in the heat of the moment, it should be to figure out how we use this for good and not to finger point, because I think that just that's not helpful in the heat of the moment of any recovery effort. People need answers, people need help.
Yeah.
And I think it's, these tools can be used as very effective ways of helping on that investigative and kind of that forensic point of view.
Definitely. To that note, I found what I thought was a really cool use case here, a pretty short and sweet one, but a very impactful one nonetheless. UC Davis has an article, and a quick shout out to UC Davis, who actually has an amazing GIS course on Coursera. I'm not sponsored, they're not being paid for that, but their GIS department at UC Davis is really, really cool. It's University of California, Davis.
Yeah.
So they have ongoing research in their mechanical and aerospace engineering department to use drones to help better predict the likelihood of a fire even starting in the first place. And they are doing that, as I understand it here. Things that cause a high wildfire risk situation are high temperature, low humidity, high wind speed. Certainly the conditions that probably led to a lot of these issues here. And they are flying drones with sensors to detect all of that, right? To predict the statistical likelihood of a fire starting there and where are the locations that it's most likely to start. As I understand it here, what's the current way to do this? Is there actually many, many towers, right? Like old fire watch towers that, even though many of them are not, don't have people in them anymore, they've been replaced with camera-based systems. So there are all these towers where apparently currently they will have cameras looking for it along with satellite aerials, and those are very helpful, and that actually is catching a lot of early fires and providing an early warning system. But their concept here is you can't put a fire tower everywhere, and it just doesn't make sense, and they take time to maintain, and so you have blind spots basically when you have these areas, especially with, like we said, how unpredictable these starts can be. So they're basically using the drone with a combination of a camera, chemical sensors, humidity sensors to basically be a mobile fire watch tower, which is cool. Very cool. Yeah.
I have a quick one on it because I did a project 2 summers ago for a company. I can't mention their name right now, but the company installs 360 cameras on these fire towers or cell towers or any sort of elevated structure. And they're partnering up with a lot of the utilities and other folks around the state. And what they're obviously their camera works in conjunction with some AI. So what it does is they have strategic locations where they can spot fire off in the distance. And then with the other cameras in the vicinity, they can triangulate the location of that fire. And then they can pinpoint where the location is and communicate that to emergency responders to try to address that flare up before it gets out of hand. So super cool way of just, again, using some technology, using 360 cameras, using AI to help in prevention and monitoring of these things.
Very, very cool. That's a great one too.
Yeah. Well, I surveyed a tower for them because they use the drone to survey the tower of like, what are the view angles and declinations and height and all this stuff. So it was a really, and then how do we install it? Where do we install it? So it was kind of a cool project.
That is very, very cool. And, I've heard of similar stuff being done for like cell tower, line of sight and stuff like that. And here in Manhattan, we use it for less, let's just say less humanitarian needs, where they use drones to help figure out what does my view in my penthouse in Park Avenue look like. But,
right.
I'm glad to hear there's a more environmentally responsible way to, use that kind of technology. Very cool. I've got another one here as we kind of move down, obviously not doing any particular order of before, during, or after the incident, but just kind of shown these use cases as we find them. I think when it comes to like prevention and that whole like getting ahead of it, controlled burns and doing that is very interesting. The whole process of doing controlled burns and when and where seems to me a topic that is constantly under, constant study and learning new things and techniques about that. And that all seems like that's all becoming more important, but there's a lot of research into better ways to do that and manage that. And so I've seen this show up a couple of times. This is actually maybe the fact that I had heard of before we even decided to do this episode, doing controlled burns via drone drop. So I guess controlled burns are often done in a manner where, I think they have some ignition device that is spread and put in certain areas, because obviously you're starting a fire, but you need to do this in a very specific manner. Right. And there's a device called the Ignis that can be mounted onto a variety of drones, and they have these little balls that are incendiary devices. I love that they call them dragon eggs. I guess that's the slang for these little balls that are chemical and light up on fire once they're dropped. And
I'm thinking of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly. That's the minute I saw that, that's what I'm thinking of, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so the really cool part of this is I think they're getting much better at making this a precision targeting thing. It kind of reminds me of like precision agriculture, right? How instead of spraying a bunch of pesticide over a large area and just saying job well done, you can take that and target areas that really needs it to reduce the amount of, collateral damage and, just the amount of material you need to use. So that's kind of how this works. They can really, really plan ahead of time where they want to do a controlled burn, exact perimeters and starting points, and it's all GPS based. So they just tell the drone fly there and drop these dragon eggs, into these areas there. And so very, very cool. And it looks like I'm seeing that they've been used in Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, and California. I was reading this from a University of Nebraska Lincoln article as well that is talking about this being a study. So very, very interesting. And again, really like kind of uplifting to see the amount of resources and research dedicated to this.
Absolutely. I think all that there is to be frustrated with and saddened about, there's lots of things on the flip side of that coin that are happening, moving things into the right direction, things we're learning about. I think we've focused quite a bit on the fire side of things, just obviously because of what's happening in Southern California right now. But we wanted to frame at least this first episode more broadly of how we're going to approach these possibly separate series of natural disasters and how these tools can help. But I did want to mention real quick, when the Hurricane Helene came through the southeast and just devastated North Carolina, North Georgia, and Florida, and I actually reached out to some of the emergency folks. I reached out to the state emergency department. I reached out to Red Cross, just seeing, hey, is there anything that I can do? I lived in Atlanta, Georgia for a while, so that part of the country is familiar to me and quite fond of the area. But I wanted to see, what can I do? Yep. And looking back, of course, I've submitted all my information, filled in some paperwork, and explained how I could do and what I could help. And I never did hear back, and I'm not disappointed, in a sense that I think if you're trying to figure out how you can help in the midst of an emergency situation, people are overwhelmed with what they have in front of them. And it's important that if you do want to participate and put your name in the hat, think about this ahead of time. Like, what are the organizations out there that provide these services? How do I get connected with my state and local jurisdictions to see what programs they have available for folks, and drone pilots in particular, or folks that operate in our realm, whether it be some of these other tools. But how can you get connected to these organizations ahead of time so that you're prepared and you're one of their authorized contractors to help out in these scenarios? So I wanted to bring that into light, because I think same thing with LA. Like, for me, it wouldn't be too terribly difficult to get down to Los Angeles and see how I could help. But I think people are just maxed out. I think it's very unlikely that I'm going to call down there and be like, hey, I have a drone. I could provide some drone mapping, point me in a direction and where to go. There's lots of bureaucracy. There's lots of things that need to happen in order for that to be the case. But that's why I'm excited to bring some professionals on that can speak to this more broadly and more specifically, because that is something that a lot of folks are genuinely interested in. It's like, again, just framing it around this drones for good. How do we use our knowledge? How do we use our tools to help in these situations? So I think it's important for other people that might be feeling the same thing, like, hey, I have a business, I do this stuff and I want to help. And I think unfortunately it might be, when it's happening, it might be too late. We've got to be ahead of the curve. So I'm excited to share some resources in future episodes here of things that people and organizations that folks can align themselves with to be in a better position to help out with future scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is a big takeaway that I have seen firsthand with a lot of like drone pilots and just people who own a drone or own a piece of technology or provide a service, saying, how can I help? It absolutely is about like the seeds you sow in the prior season. It is very, very difficult to put together a team of ragtag drone pilots and stuff last minute. The effectiveness of everyone from your sheriff's office to firefighters to volunteer groups,
search and rescue.
Yeah. It is totally dependent on how well the planning is done. And I can speak this a little bit because I have volunteered with Civil Air Patrol for many years. I was one of the main UAS pilot trainers for New York Wing, which is like all of New York's Civil Air Patrol groups together. Mm-hmm. And I cannot tell you how much we trained and created checklists and operations and preparation. And it really is like rehearsing for a show. It's not about the show. It's the rehearsal makes the show. And that's very similar to how these incidents go down. It is all based on the preparation, the coordination well ahead of time to have a successful outcome. I will add to that though, for anyone who is like really interested in getting involved in this stuff, obviously it's going to be specific to where you are locally. And this information is really only applicable to the United States. But having said that, I highly encourage you to go to FEMA.gov and check out these ICS courses, the Incident Command System. They are free courses. Anyone can log on and just watch them. A bunch of videos and PowerPoint. And it really, I think, will give you a great appreciation for the structure in which everything from search and rescue to disaster management is handled. Long story short is that years and years ago, as we encountered more and more incidents like this, FEMA stepped in and said, it can't be the local sheriff's office does one thing and then the county fire department does something else, and no one talks to each other. So the incident command system is this pretty cool system in which different organizations can pull resources and be prepared to handle this. So I encourage you to check that out. And then exactly like you said, Mike, check with your local police, your local fire, local organizations. I can't say enough good things about Civil Air Patrol. It's a great one. And there's usually they're nationwide. So, but understanding that this is done a season in advance is the important part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a good segue too, to shift out of, because I know that we're going to focus more on some of the ways that these tools help in disasters, preventative, during, post. So we're going to talk more about that in subsequent episodes with some really knowledgeable folks. But I think we wanted to finish out by talking about the regulations around natural disasters that help protect the first responders. And again, highlighting the dipshittery that happened down in, I mean, I just,
that's a great way to put it. Actually,
I got so mad when I saw that, just so angry. And so let's run down the list. And again, this shouldn't be news to commercial pilots, but treating this again as kind of this public service announcement. If you're listening as a recreational pilot, there are things that you need to know to keep people safe and to not be giving the drone industry a black eye. So let's start out with this first one, Scott. I think it's the TFR. Do you want to explain what that stands for and what that means and how that functions for the regular day in, day out, and then during an emergency response?
Yeah, absolutely. So TFRs, for those not in the know, and again, you drone pilots should know this, they are temporary flight restrictions. And so you can think of them as absolute no-go zones if you're a drone pilot. They're usually set up to establish security, despite the fact that they're called temporary flight restrictions. Many of them are almost permanent. A good example is there's one that sits over Washington, D.C., 24/7, 365, to protect the airspace in our nation's capital. But they're all used as emergency TFRs, and those can pop up pretty much anytime and anywhere as the situation calls for it. So as you can imagine, most large areas around Los Angeles are currently surrounded in emergency TFRs. It is super simple to figure out where a TFR is. You go to tfr.fa.gov. There's a list of every single TFR that is either happening today or pending in the next several weeks. And it tells you everything on each TFR. It tells you where it is, altitudes, the reason behind it. So, for example, here, I've just gone to tfr.fa.gov. There is one for Malibu, California. It's going from January 14th to the 28th, so most of the month. And it says right here, reason to provide a safe environment for firefighting aircraft ops. Gives you the exact boundaries on a map. So, it's like no excuses. You need to know this. Many drones will even lock you out and prevent you from flying in the TFRs, but not necessarily an emergency TFR because they happen so fast that they don't necessarily get pushed to the drone geofencing systems. So it's on the drone pilot to look at this stuff. Just because your drone will let you fly there doesn't mean you're good to fly there. You need to check if you're legally.
And even if, you should be going to this website and looking for TFRs, but it's almost 100% guarantee that if there's a natural disaster, that area has a TFR in place. So don't fly your drone in those areas, even as tempting as it might be to get something for your social media or whatever you're doing with it, or maybe you're using it to have a look at your house that burned down and you're just trying to share with family and friends. Please do not do that. I think what happened demonstrates why.
Exactly.
And I will say too, like, even if you have no intentions of flying 1,000 feet up in the air, which you're not supposed to either, even if you're like, oh, I'm just going to put it 20 feet up in the air, the conditions could be so erratic with winds, and obviously what's happening down there, the 100-mile-an-hour winds is just absolutely crazy. Like, the crazy things can happen to your equipment in those environments, and ash gets in your motors and rotors, and you can't plan for a smooth flight when there's all kinds of uncontrolled situations happening around you. So just do not do that.
Exactly. I should add to this too, that just because you're not in a TFR doesn't mean it's now a good idea to fly. TFRs are, it doesn't mean like right outside the TFR is like, oh, let me just do whatever I want, because the TFR is the area they've established where they're having the firefighter operations, but there's probably more aircraft in the air in the surrounding area than there are on any other given day. And they're flying low and they're flying slow, mostly for firefighting ops. So you are, just by the nature of a TFR being anywhere around you there, you are probably in an area where other more important flights are going on right now that you really don't want to be anywhere near.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I'm kind of focusing on the recreational community right now, because there are so many people that have drones, and what are the things that they should be doing to educate themselves, and what are some of the things that are required, and then what are some of the things that maybe could be changed about these requirements that help it be a little more front and center, help people understand what they should be doing. And I'm specifically talking about the trust certificate. So maybe let's share a little bit about what that is and the intent of it and how we feel like it can be improved.
Yeah, absolutely. So the trust certificate is basically a test that the FAA came out with to really educate even recreational flyers. So to take a step back, right, there's commercial drone pilots who are absolutely required to get their Part 107 certificate. That's basically your driver's license, right? Rules of the road, all of that. But it is now also required, to have the trust certificate as well. So the trust certificate is kind of like a Part 107 light, right? The understanding that you're not doing this for a living, you just want to go out and have fun. You don't. It's not a higher. The standard that you need to meet is much, much lower. As in, you don't have to like go to a testing center and take a test. This is all an online thing. Again, you can go to fa.gov/UAS and check out all the information on the trust certificate. But the long story short is it tells you the basics you need to know. Airspace, airports, TFRs, all this stuff we're talking about, basically how to stay out of other pilots' way and the basic safety minimums you should follow, even if you're flying for fun. I think it's quite a good thing. It's easy enough to take, and it really tells you everything you need to know. You drive a car on the road, you need a driver's license. You need to know the rules of the road. It makes a lot of sense to require the same thing when you are flying a drone.
And for clarity, is everyone who owns a drone required to get a trust certificate?
I'm trying to remember that.
I think it's yes. I know there's this 256 gram rule. So again, for folks that are tuning in who aren't in the weeds of this stuff. So there's drones that if it weighs less than 256 grams, which is for all practical purposes a DJI Mini, then it doesn't push it above a certain threshold to get certain certifications around flying it. So every drone pilot, you should go out and get that trust certificate. It's not hard. Mm-hmm. It's easy to do. And it may even be a requirement for every single drone pilot. Again, I'd have to clarify that, or we'd have to clarify that.
So you can fly recreationally under Part 107. Actually, you can. There are differences though, and we won't get into all those specifics now. But you can fly 107 for recreational purposes, but you must follow every rule of 107. There are certain Part 107, really in the weed items that are not required for recreational flyers. But you can't just say, hey, I'm being a recreational flyer today. I don't like this part of Part 107. Don't worry about it. At that point, you need the trust. So the long story short is, it's great to have both because that gives you the option to fly under, let's just say, the recreational carve-outs that the FAA has made, understanding that not everyone is doing this for money. The trust certificate is simple, but maybe segueing into the next part here, what I do find a little unfortunate is it's simple, but the communication on whether or not you need a trust certificate has not been as simple. It's something that I would like to see much more of, just shown to recreational drone pilots front and center. I think we were talking about that earlier, and I kind of got the sense you agreed with that too, Mike. It is, you don't know what you don't know, right? So you need to know this trust certificate exists and that there are rules of the road.
Yeah.
And
I think a good example of that is a 15-year-old kid gets a drone for Christmas.
Yes.
Right. And they're so excited. They take it outside and they go fly it without even a thought of like, well, what's involved with flying this drone? Do I need to register it? Do I need to have a trust certificate? And the answer to that is we've just demonstrated is yes.
Yep.
So I think what you're speaking to is what mechanisms can be in place other than the FAA that helps support their intention or their requirement. And I think what we're kind of getting down to is the resellers of these of this equipment, like the Best Buys, the Amazons, the drone stores, the hobby stores. Like how can they play a part in selling you something? And maybe there's a waiver you have to sign that clearly states you have to do this in order before you fly this drone, or there's this big red slip of paper that comes when it's stuffed in the bag. I just think there's more that could be done there.
Absolutely. And like, maybe I'll start by who I think is doing this right. I mean, if you purchase a hobbyist drone from most DJI like authorized resellers, like I know many colleagues who sell drones commercially to drone pilots like myself, but they stock hobby DJI drones and all sorts of hobby drones as well. They're a great source to purchase from because many of them will offer you training as part of just purchasing from them, but they're going to give you the rules of the road right from the get-go and let you know what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
But just like you said, where the struggle is once you talk to like Amazon and Best Buy and these stores where selling a hobbyist drone is one of many, many things they sell. So they're not even thinking of what you need to know. They're treating it like buying a cell phone or buying any other electronic device. But it's different. Your iPhone does not participate in the nation's airspace, is what I like to tell people. I mean, maybe there's a special case you can buy that makes it do that. I don't know, but it's something you really want to think about. It is very different than buying a cell phone or even a toy RC car because it flies. Yep. So I do think more work needs to be done on requiring any seller of a drone like Amazon to. I mean, there are different ways to do this. I have no problem taking maybe a pretty hardline stance on this and saying I have no problem if you were required to upload your trust certificate to Amazon before they completed the purchase of a drone. I don't think that's a crazy idea because it's free. It's a little bit of time and it doesn't take much effort at all to do.
Like maybe there's a geofence that comes installed in the drone that it won't even fire up until you submit this trust certificate.
Right. And that's another way to do it. And like you'd see more sophisticated drone companies like DJI could implement that. But it's tricky because you have these drones that are it's an interesting thing because a lot of the drones that are really, really small and don't have onboard computers, right? They tend to have really small flight times, and it's hard to get that drone even like a few hundred feet away from you without it just dying due to battery life and all that. But that's not a guarantee. You still, right? There's still the capability and the possibility to do that. So there has to be some mechanism, I think, that regardless of drone, regardless of its size, if a trust certificate is required, you're going to need to provide some proof that you've looked at it and that you've seen it before you operate it.
Yeah, maybe there's a threshold, right?
Yeah.
If your drone can do this, fly this far away from your controller or at this altitude, then you have to have a trust certificate because you would think that most of those drones have the technology to implement some of these things. And that got me thinking about it. I bought a little cheap drone for my son when he was younger for Christmas one year, and we went out in the street and it did it was like the tiny little toy thing, but he flew it up and maybe 50 feet away and lost signal, and it just flew into a tree and never to be found again.
Exactly.
He was like, oh.
And just thought this was curious because I was just looking up. I was trying to remind myself, how does Europe do it? And the EU does it by weight. They say you don't need any license if it's less than 250 grams. And if it's more than that, you need to obtain at least basically the equivalent of the trust certificate, I believe.
Yeah.
Probably a little more restricted than the trust, to be honest. But I mean, all else being equal, I agree with that. I think that's a good way to do it. We've always gone on weight because it's the closest thing we have to correlate like kinetic damage. It's the closest thing we have to say how much damage can the drone actually do. Well, not necessarily a perfect system. It is an easy one to measure and an easy one to quantify. So I'm pretty in line with that. I do think at bare minimum. So, if lots of toy drones that are heavier than that and can do some damage. So
for sure. Yeah. Well, I think if we were going to distill this, it really, and I'm targeting the hobbyist and the recreational drone pilots because this training is a mandatory thing for a commercial pilot. But for you folks out there that enjoy flying your drone, educate yourself, get your trust certificate, please.
100% there. Yeah. And it's easy. Just Google it, right?
Yeah.
So that's the bare minimum.
And it's free. It's free. And okay, well, we're once again, we have filled up an hour plus, Scott, and always a pleasure to sit down and chat with you about these things. And I'm excited about this series in particular because I think it's going to come in different segments of how we're using drones for good And we're going to continue this conversation with some experts here in the very near future that's relevant to what's happening not only in Southern California, but more broadly and globally. So I think there's going to be some really informative and exciting things coming up related to this topic. And we're super glad you guys joined us.
Yes, definitely. I'm looking forward to it too.
Great. All right. Well, until next time, Scott, have a good one.
You too. Take care.